Good day. Today is Tuesday, 17th October, and despite many predictions and discussions, there's been no sign so far of an Israeli ground operation in Gaza. Now, yesterday there was a long article in the Jerusalem Post which set out some of the reasons. Firstly, it said that there was considerable concern within Israel that in the event that there was an Israeli military operation in Gaza, the huge deployment of Israeli troops, which this would require, might expose the northern border, Israel's border, to attack, and that might lead to action on the part of Hezbollah, the Shia militia located in Lebanon, which has long had issues with Israel. It's fought wars with Israel in the past, including a successful defensive war, which it fought against Israel in 2006, that the Israelis are worried that they cannot therefore leave their northern territory unguarded, and that will reduce the number of their troops that could be deployed in Gaza, and that might complicate the military operation. And for that reason, there's been a delay in the operation because of this. But there is another reason also discussed in the Jerusalem Post, and I believe and I suspect that behind all the various veil of reasons that have been given, the weather conditions, the concerns about Hezbollah, the concerns about Iran, I think that the ultimate reason is the one set out in this article in the Jerusalem Post, which mirrors comments made by many, including myself, in programs on this channel, which is that the Israeli military is balking at the challenge of a military operation in Gaza. This heavily built up territory, populated by millions of people, in which Hamas has operated now for decades, building up its forces, training its fighters, creating large stores of ammunition and other supplies, establishing its huge network of fortifications and tunnels and bunkers. In other words, creating in Gaza an urban fortress which the Israeli military would have serious problems overrunning and breaking through. And the article in the Jerusalem Post went on to admit a point made by Seymour Hersh in one of his recent articles, drawing on information he's received from his various contacts and sources. Anyway, apparently the Israeli military are concerned that their infantry, their soldiers, are young in the main and inexperienced, that they don't have the knowledge and the skills for this type of fighting, that this isn't something, to go directly to what the Jerusalem Post has said, that this isn't something that Israel has itself done recently and which it doesn't perhaps fully know how to do. And I suspect that this is the basic problem. This is the problem that Israel is now confronting and which is holding them back. And it seems that last week they did have a plan. The plan was that the people of Gaza in the north would leave and move to the south, that eventually the entire population of Gaza would leave Gaza, and this would leave this territory open for the Israelis. And Seymour Hersh has provided some discussion as to how this would be done, for the Israelis to rain massive bunker-busting bombs where they believe the Hamas tunnels and the Hamas bunkers are located, with the job that the infantry would then have to do being reduced basically to finishing off the Hamas survivors and clearing the rubble. And coming back to what I was saying yesterday, apparently it seems that there was a plan that, or at least a proposal, that the Egyptians open the border between Egypt and Jordan, that all of these millions of people in Gaza leave and resettle in Sinai, and there was talk apparently of setting up a tent city there to house them, and the Israeli government proposed that Qatar, the chief financial backer of Hamas, one of the richest of the Gulf kingdoms, that Qatar foot the bill. Well, as I said in previous programs, if this was the plan, it ran into obvious and ultimately insuperable problems, in that there was never any possibility, any realistic possibility, in my opinion, that the Egyptians would freely and voluntarily agree to this sort of proposal, or that the Egyptians would work with the Qataris to build tent cities or to do any of these sort of things. And we've now had a series of statements by Arab officials, senior Arab officials, in meetings with US Secretary of State Blinken, which shows how this plan was never in the end going to succeed, how there was no realistic possibility that the Egyptians or other Arab states would agree to this. Now, the first meeting was one that Secretary of State Blinken had on the 15th of October in Cairo with the Egyptian President al-Sisi of Egypt, the man who ultimately would have to make the decision to allow these millions of people to enter Gaza, to leave Gaza and to enter Egypt, which is what this plan was supposedly all about. And there's a video, the Egyptians filmed the meeting, and they filmed al-Sisi's introductory comments. And I have to say, I found al-Sisi not only taking an extremely strong position, but in his behavior towards Blinken, it struck me that he was, to be frank, almost rude. And after, of course, denouncing the violence of Hamas, he then went on to say this. This is, and I'm taking this, by the way, these words of al-Sisi's from the US State Department's website. They provided a transcript of al-Sisi's words. Very important to say that throughout these 5 rounds of conflict, innocent lives were claimed. And he means, of course, the 5 rounds of conflict going all the way back to the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948 and the war that took place in that year. And then he goes on to say, and I'm going to state the numbers, and I want to state the numbers because any delay in resolving this issue, trying to find a solution, and he means a overall solution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, will just lead to more victims. Victims are, after Palestinian, and then there's an inaudible sound, amounted to 12,500 civilians. And I believe that he means 12,500 civilians killed, lost, since this latest flare-up crisis began on the 7th of October. And then he goes on to make some pointed comparisons. On the Israeli side, they lost 2,700 people, including 1,500 in this last crisis. What I'm talking about is information that everyone can check. We're talking about 100,000 Palestinians injured and 12,000, and then we're told it's inaudible. So it's not difficult to work out what he means, that far more Palestinians have been killed, including over the course of this latest incident, than Israelis. And then he goes on to say, al-Sisi goes on to say, we're talking about children. We're talking about 2,500 Palestinian children who were victims and 150 on the Israeli side. I'm saying this now because we're facing here a huge crisis, and I'm concerned about the reaction. They just overextend, and he means the Israelis, the right of self-defense, and it turns into a convicted punishment of 2.3 million Palestinians living in, and he means Gaza. Again, the State Department thing says it's inaudible. And he then begins to become, as I said, in my opinion, borderline rude. Yes, it is true what happened over the past 9 days was very difficult and too much, and we unequivocally condemn it. But we need to understand that this is the result of accumulated fury and hatred over 4 decades where the Palestinians had no hope to find a solution. Many people ask, is this the right time to speak about this or only to find a way out of the current crisis? But what I am saying here is that trying hard to get clear, to lay the right foundation for our effort and then again, it's inaudible, because we have to evade very dire consequences that would afflict the Middle East. We're trying very hard to contain and resolve the crisis and avoid any other parties getting into the conflict. And then al-Sisi becomes, frankly, personal. Mr. Secretary, you spoke about the crisis and you spoke as a Jewish person. And let me tell you that I'm an Egyptian citizen and I was born and brought up in a neighborhood where we had Jewish neighbors. Let me stress, I'm taking all of this from the State Department's website. And Jews who used to live here in Egypt not ever suffered from oppression and persecution targeted. By the way, I'm not sure that's actually true, but anyway, that is what al-Sisi said. As a matter of fact, the Jews were never targeted in the inaudible, in over and throughout the whole history. Again, that's his interpretation of history. I'm not sure I'm fully in agreement with that, but never mind. Maybe we were persecuted in Europe, in certain European countries and some other countries, but this would not happen before. What is happening now and what we see now is a tidal wave that is a direct consequence of the crisis and its accumulated symptoms. This requires us to work, as I said, forcibly and with full determination. It is very important to reduce the flame and to make sure that we deliver the assistance needed to, and then again it's inaudible, that is under siege, where it is completely deprived of the basic services, food, water, electricity and fuel. The infrastructure is deteriorating and coming down to zero. We need to hear, and then again it's inaudible, we need to hear each other, and we need to hear this from us, because we are the people who know the region. We are the ones who are very much interested and living day by day at everything that is happening in the region. And who committed the crime, the actual crime? It was the extremists. This, and then it's inaudible, and that is why we need to work together very diligently. I don't want to talk too much. I welcome you, and I hope this is an opportunity for us to have, and that it's inaudible and a good chance where we work to give a strong momentum to finding a solution. and to resolving this crisis. That is the president of Egypt essentially throwing the book at Blinken, blaming the Americans and, of course, to some extent, the Israelis, doing so, in my opinion, as I said, in language which becomes, in my opinion, altogether too personal. But anyway, the opinion is clear enough. Now, why did al-Sisi respond so vigorously in this way? I think he's been under a great deal of pressure over the last couple of days to open the border, and he is pushing back, and he's pushing back hard, and he's telling the Americans and he's telling the Israelis, we're not going to do this. This isn't what we are going to do. Ultimately, this is your fault. You've brought us to this point. You've created this thing. There's never been a proper, satisfactory resolution of this problem, and we are not going to do what you want us to do. And today, we have had the King of Jordan, King Abdullah II of Jordan, and he is talking essentially in the same way, rather more diplomatically, it must be said, doing so over the course of a press conference held in Amman, Jordan's capital, with Chancellor Olaf Scholz of Germany, who once again has gone to the region looking ineffective and ineffectual, and I have to say straightforwardly, rather bewildered. And I take this now from the Financial Times. Jordan has warned the Middle East is at the edge of an abyss as diplomatic activity intensifies to prevent the Israel-Hamas war from spiraling into a regional conflict. King Abdullah of Jordan delivered his warning together with a call for humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip and a refusal to take in Palestinian refugees who might never return home, ahead of a summit with US President Joe Biden on Wednesday. And now we have the King's actual words. The whole region is on the brink of falling into the abyss. The threat that this conflict spreads is real. The costs are too high. And then the Financial Times says, Jordan, which borders Israel and the occupied West Bank, has long been concerned that it could be destabilized by a massive influx of Palestinians. King Abdullah was also speaking a day after Iran warned that the Islamist militants it backs, this is the Financial Times referring to Hezbollah. I don't quite know why it doesn't mention Hezbollah by name, but anyway, it backs would resort to preemptive attacks against Israel, and as the Israeli military traded fire with Tehran's ally Hezbollah, the South Lebanon-based militia. And then King Abdullah went on to say that admitting refugees was a red line for Jordan and for Egypt. In other words, he's been in contact with al-Sisi. They're taking a joint line on this. And he went on to say, and these are his exact words, again, I'm taking this from the Financial Times, no refugees into Jordan and no refugees into Egypt either. That's a situation that must be dealt with inside Gaza and the West Bank, and the burden shouldn't be borne on others' shoulders. So we can see, looks as if Blinken and Scholz have been traveling to the Middle East, each trying to get the Egyptians, and to some extent it seems the Jordanians also, to agree to open their borders to allow a vast influx of refugees from Gaza and from the West Bank, from the Palestinian territories. And The Egyptians and the Jordanians are saying no, and they're saying no in the most strong and unequivocal terms. And the King of Jordan has now said that for them this is a red line. They're not going to shift on this position. And we see from the State Department's transcript of his words how absolutely furious the President of Egypt, President al-Sisi, was in response to all of this pressure, and how, as I said, he started to make comments to Blinken, which, as I said, I find frankly rude and expressed in, well, shall we say, a somewhat indelicate way. Anyway, the Financial Times goes on to say that there is now a straightforward impasse about the border. Egypt is prepared to open the border for humanitarian convoys to enter Gaza to provide relief supplies there and to allow people with dual citizenship or indeed foreign citizenship to leave Gaza. These are people from the West, from Russia, from all of these places. The Israelis absolutely reject that. They will not allow the crossing points to be opened. They have joint control of the crossing points, and there's even been apparently some Israeli airstrikes on some of the crossing points, though I don't know the exact details, and I don't know whether this is fully true. So the Israelis refuse to allow the humanitarian convoys to go in, the foreign nationals to come out, and the Egyptians and the Jordanians, for their part, are saying refugees, the Palestinians in Gaza, they will not be allowed to leave. So we have an impasse. We have a situation where the Israelis are nervous about mounting a ground operation in Gaza, whilst Gaza remains heavily populated with its people. They also probably underestimate the difficulties of such an operation, even if the people were there, even if the people had gone. But even they seem to understand that it's impossible for this operation to take place whilst the people are there, or at least they're hesitating to carry it out. Whereas the Egyptians and the Jordanians are simply saying straightforwardly, and they're saying it to the Israelis, no doubt, with whom they have diplomatic relations, but also to the Americans, to Blinken, and to the Germans, Olaf Scholz, that they're not prepared to let their borders, open their borders, and to allow millions of people to leave. The Jordanians and the Egyptians clearly have been in contact with each other, and as King Abdullah has said, this is a red line. Now, President Biden, as I speak, is heading for the Middle East. He's going to visit Israel. He's going to meet Prime Minister Netanyahu, with whom, by the way, he historically has not been on good terms. But he's going to visit Israel, and then he's going to move on from Israel to Jordan, to Amman. And whilst in Jordan, there he's going to have a summit meeting, not just with the King of Jordan, King Abdullah, but also with President al-Sisi, who's going to join him there and who will speak to him there, and also with President Ahmed Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority. And we can see that the Egyptians and the Jordanians are coordinating with each other so that if Biden does arrive in Amman, Jordan's capital, and meet these Arab leaders, and start talking again about the idea of opening crossing points, the Jordanians and the Egyptians will have agreed between each other that they will once again tell him no, and that they will reiterate that as far as they're concerned, this is a red line. So we are in effect at an impasse. The Israeli advance into Gaza is not taking place because the Egyptians and the Jordanians are refusing to cooperate. And in the case of the Egyptians, they're coming forward and saying, mirroring, echoing the words of President Putin, that there has to be a negotiation to resolve the underlying problem of the Palestinian conflict. That is, in effect, what al-Sisi was also saying to Blinken. So the Egyptians and the Jordanians are making this stance, and to be honest, I don't think it's going to change. Now, Blinken has also had that meeting, which eventually did take place, with the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia. And as I said, this happened after he arrived in Riyadh. The Saudis kept him waiting all night long. Apparently it wasn't MBS, as I thought, whom he met, which in itself is something of an insult at this time, or at least maybe not an insult, but a snub. You would have thought that in a time of crisis like this, the US Secretary of State would be meeting the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. But anyway, never mind. He did meet the foreign minister, the Saudi foreign minister, and we have a transcript, again from the State Department, of what the Foreign Minister al-Saud, said, and this time, as is always the case with the Saudis, it was couched in far more polite language than the language used by al-Sisi, and far less melodramatic language than the language used by King Abdullah. But the message, the underlying message conveyed is the same. And after commenting upon the historically good relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia, the State Department website provides this transcript of what al-Saud said. It is a disturbing situation, it is a very difficult situation, and the primary sufferer of the situation are civilians. Civilian populations on both sides are being affected. And here it's important, I think, that we all condemn the targeting of civilians in any form, at any time, by anyone. And that, of course, extends to the Hamas attack, obviously, but it also extends to Israel. And then al-Saud goes on to say, and I think that's something that's very clear, that's something that's clearly adopted by the Arab League. But that said, the priority now needs to be to stop further civilian suffering. And that, of course, relates to the bombing and blockade of Gaza. And here we need to find a way to quickly de-escalate the situation, to quickly bring back peace, to at least stopping the guns and then working towards addressing the humanitarian challenges. So here I have to emphasize that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is very, very difficult, and we need to work together to make sure that access for humanitarian relief and humanitarian goods is allowed. That is something that is critical and is, of course, enshrined in international law. And we need to work together to find a way out of this cycle of violence. This is something that we really, really need to focus on. Without a concerted effort to end this constant return to violence. It will always be the civilians that suffer first, and always be civilians on both sides that end up paying the price. So I hope that we can find a way to de-escalate the current situation and then hopefully move forward to a more permanent solution. So once again, doesn't here talk about millions of people being essentially relocated out of Gaza, but he clearly rejects that because he talks about the urgency of providing them with relief supplies. He says, Saudi Foreign Minister says, correctly, that this is an obligation enshrined in international law. He is therefore, in effect, saying that this closing of the border to prevent relief supplies entering Gaza is a violation of international law. And like al-Sisi, he talks about the need for a permanent solution, a final sustainable solution to the problem of the conflict in the Middle East, the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, between the Arabs and the Jews. That is what al-Saud is talking about. Now, that's American diplomacy, if it can be called that. I have to say, judging from the State Department's website, Secretary Blinken seems to me to have been giving more interviews with various parts of the media than he's been holding high-level meetings. Well, that's probably most unfair, actually. But anyway, he does seem to have been giving a lot of interviews, perhaps more than I think is appropriate at this time. But anyway, that is American diplomacy at the moment. I would say that something else is also going on, and it is somewhat mysterious and difficult to understand. And that is an American military build-up in the region, which is on an enormous scale. We now have one US carrier group deployed to the eastern Mediterranean. It is apparently going to be joined by a second carrier group. There are large deployments of fighter and bomber jets to the Middle East. Not at all clear what they're supposed to be doing. We're having large numbers of American troops being deployed in the Middle East as well, principally, so far as I can see, in Jordan. Supposedly, all of this is intended to deter Iran and its various proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the various Shia militias in Iraq. But many people are saying that the sheer scale of this build-up is greater than would make logical sense in terms of mere deterrence. It has something of the look about it of a forward deployment of troops in advance of some sort of major military operation. There's all kinds of speculation circulating that this is either intended to intimidate Iran or to launch some kind of attack on Iran. The Moon of Alabama is speculating about an attack on Syria. Perhaps it's intended to intimidate and frighten Hezbollah in Lebanon. Who knows what it is intended to do? Who knows what the plan, if any, is? But anyway, this build-up is now taking place. It is on an enormous scale. And I think, again, far from reassuring people or calming people, it is creating heightened tension in the Middle East when conducted on this scale, and is leading to questions about what it is that the United States is intending to do. Anyway, that's the Americans. Now, yesterday, President Putin, as I said, had a series of telephone conversations with Arab leaders. And I thought that he'd probably had a conversation with President Assad. It has now been confirmed that he did. And the Kremlin has now provided a readout of these conversations and has identified the people whom Putin spoke to. And they were President of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, President of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi, President of Palestine, Mahmoud Abbas, and President of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. So, alongside the Arab leaders, and this I didn't know when I made my program yesterday, it turns out that Putin also spoke with the President of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi. And as we will see in a moment, Putin also spoke, after he spoke to all of these people, with no less a person than Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. Now, just take a step back and think in terms of diplomacy what this means. We're told in the West that President Putin is a global pariah, but nobody wants to speak to him. Nobody wants to meet with him. Well, this supposed global pariah is able to speak to the President of Iran and the Prime Minister of Israel, President Raisi, and Prime Minister Netanyahu on one and the same day. He's able to hold civil conversations with both. And it seems that the entire Middle East, as we will discuss shortly, is interested in speaking with him. And in fact, that's essentially what took place yesterday. Now, the Russians have provided a readout of a single readout for President Putin's talk with the leaders, the Arab leaders, and with the President of Iran. And I will read it out. It is relatively short. During the discussions, the focus was on the rapidly escalating Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The parties expressed deep concern about the massive escalation of hostilities that have led to a catastrophic increase in civilian casualties and a deepening humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. They unanimously agreed on the need to immediately cease fire and to establish a humanitarian truce in order to provide urgent help to those in need. So, here again, what al-Sisi is saying, what the Saudis told Blinken, what King Abdullah has told Schultz. We need a ceasefire. We need humanitarian supplies to be sent into Gaza. All of these leaders, al-Sisi, Assad, Raisi, Mahmoud Abbas, they all agreed with Putin about this. And then the readout goes on to say the following. The Russian president listened to the views and assessments provided by his counterparts, who highlighted the severity of the humanitarian situation in Gaza and the need to lift the blockade in order to fast-track the delivery of medications, food, and other essential supplies. Serious concerns were voiced about the possibility of the conflict evolving into a regional war. In response, Vladimir Putin emphasized the unacceptability of using any form of violence against civilians and conveyed Russia's deep sympathy for all those affected and the families and friends of the people who have died in the hostilities, and noted Russia's readiness to provide humanitarian aid. The Russian side reaffirmed its commitment to coordinating efforts with all constructively minded partners with an eye towards bringing the hostilities to an end and destabilizing the situation. This aligns with Russia's submission to the UN Security Council of a draft resolution calling for an immediate, balanced and non-politicized ceasefire. Now, the key words here are coordinating efforts with all constructively minded partners. Anyway, it then goes on to say, the readout goes on to say, the parties agreed that the current unprecedented escalation is rooted in the prolonged stagnation in the Middle East peace process. In this context, Vladimir Putin reiterated his principled stance in favor of restarting the political process to achieve a lasting and fair resolution to the Palestinian issue on an established international legal basis, which would provide for the creation of an independent Palestinian state coexisting in peace and security with Israel. In a conversation with the President of Egypt, the issues related to facilitating the evacuation of Russian citizens and the citizens of the Commonwealth of Independent States from the Gaza Strip by Egypt were also touched upon. So, Russia coordinating efforts by constructively minded partners towards bringing an end to the hostilities. In other words, getting a ceasefire and humanitarian relief provided to Gaza and stabilizing the situation. But all of them in agreement that the underlying cause is to use the Russian words, prolonged stagnation in the Middle East peace process. The Russians are saying it, the Egyptians are saying it, the Jordanians are saying it, the Saudis are saying it also. And as this readout shows, the Iranians also agree. Now, apparently directly after these calls, Putin also spoke to Netanyahu. And the Russians have provided a readout of this call also. And it says the following. This is the readout now of the Kremlin's readout of the telephone call between Putin and Netanyahu. The focus was on the crisis situation caused by the dramatic escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The President of Russia expressed his sincere condolences to the families and friends of the Israeli victims and stressed his total rejection and condemnation of any actions that result in civilian casualties, including among women and children. Vladimir Putin laid out the steps being taken by Russia to help normalize the situation to prevent the further escalation of violence and to avert a humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. And then comes the key sentence. In particular, the Israeli side was informed of the key points of today's telephone calls with the leaders of Palestine, Egypt, Iran, and Syria. Russia's principled commitment to continue its work to end the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and achieve a peaceful settlement through political and diplomatic means was reaffirmed. Now, the Israelis have given their own account of this conversation, and it's clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu stated unequivocally that for Israel, the absolute priority is the destruction of Hamas. Israel at the moment is not prepared to settle for anything less, and that means, obviously, that as far as the Israelis are concerned, there can be no discussion for the moment of any sort of ceasefire. Now, Putin and the Russians will have known this in advance. The purpose of Putin's call to Netanyahu was not to win Netanyahu round. Putin will have known that that was impossible. It was to brief Netanyahu on what Putin has discussed with the leaders of Palestine, Egypt, Iran, and Syria. Note, Iran and Syria are Israel's strongest enemies in the Middle East. The Israelis often talk about Iran as posing an existential threat to themselves. What Putin is doing is he's taking the first steps, tentative steps, towards establishing some kind of bridge, some kind of mediation effort between the Israelis and their adversaries in the Middle East, with a view in time to finding a way through the crisis. Now, I should explain that that is exactly what mediators do. I have in the past myself acted as a mediator in legal and professional contexts. And the point of a mediator is not to come up with solutions, some global solutions, or even to propose solutions, at least not initially. Nor is it to get the two sides into the same room and to get them talking to each other. It is to establish some kind of communication. So the Syrians, the Egyptians, the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, President Abbas, the Egyptians, of course, they can tell things to Putin. Putin can then convey to the Israelis, to Netanyahu, what the Iranians and the Syrians and the others are telling him. And then he, or to be more precise, the Russians, can take this back to the Iranians and the Syrians, take back to them what the Israelis are saying in response. And that is classic mediation. That is exactly how mediation works. As I said, I've done it. And of course, initially, neither side moves. Each restates their position. Each side takes hard line, and heavens knows, in this conflict, they've been doing that for decades. And it's unrealistic to expect that this will change immediately or indeed any time soon. But eventually, and this is what mediation is supposed to do, establishing communications in this way, over time, it does lead to a route for each side through the person in the middle, the mediator, the honest broker. It leads to a process whereby they start making actual proposals, and then eventually, when the proposals have been worked upon and some points can be agreed, when the two sides, with the mediator, of course, still there, finally agree to meet. And this can be an extremely prolonged and labour-intensive process, as I know for myself, from my own experience. It can take a very, very long time to happen. But external events, in this instance, in this case, is probably what is going to push them closer together. Because obviously all of these countries, Iran, Egypt, Syria, don't want a wider conflict in the Middle East. The Israelis want some kind of resolution to the Gaza issue, but with a military offensive in Gaza facing serious challenges, with the Jordanians and the Egyptians refusing to take millions of refugees. The Israelis are at an impasse. So are, in a different kind of way, the Middle East countries, which find that there has been no progress from their perspective in finding a fundamental resolution. And under the pressure of these events, in order to try to break through this impasse, time and perhaps further pressure from the events as they unfold, maybe difficulties in whatever ground operation Israel eventually launches in the Gaza Strip, whatever that amounts to, eventually, over time, if you work as a mediator in this way, you do start to find that people do begin to talk. As I said, it can take a very long time in the Middle East. It's not going to happen in weeks or months. It might take many years. But at least this is possibly, perhaps, a kind of a start, though there have been many false starts in the Middle East up to now, and nobody can be sure that this is going to be one. Nobody can, by the way, ever guarantee an outcome. It's often said that you can take a horse to water, but you cannot make it drink. It may be that the Israelis and the Palestinians are so embedded in their positions. It may also be the case that even if there's a large majority of Palestinians and Israelis who do want peace, they will continue to find it impossible to break with the extreme hardliners amongst them and achieve a peace together. As I said, no outcome here is guaranteed, but at least it's a try. It's an actual effort to do this. Anyway, that's what the Russians are doing, at least in terms of their discussions with the Arab leaders and the Iranians, and of course with the Israelis, with Netanyahu himself. And of course the Russians did something else yesterday, which is that they put together a draft resolution for a ceasefire, calling for a ceasefire and calling for humanitarian relief supplies to be sent into Gaza, and they put it before the Security Council. And as I've said in my previous program, this was not the resolution that is eventually going to be put together and which will hopefully one day at some point over the next few weeks and months be the resolution that finally crystallizes and ends this conflict. This was what the Russians would say was putting a marker down, setting out Russian thinking, setting out what the Russians want to do, and seeking to attract support by doing it. And it's clear that they have a lot of progress still to make. Now, the United States, its allies, Britain and France, and the other European countries, Albania, for example, predictably were opposed to this resolution. Any resolution of any sort proposed by Russia to the UN Security Council is at this time going to be opposed by the United States and its allies. But it did meet some support from some of the countries of the global south. Gabon and Mozambique, for example, voted in favour. However, other countries still are on the fence. Brazil, a BRICS partner, abstained. And for the moment, clearly, there isn't yet that critical mass behind this resolution that would have enabled it to pass. I don't believe, as I said already, that the Russians expected it to pass. But by putting that resolution forward, they've set out their stand. They've also seen what the global reaction is. They've seen that in the Middle East and in Africa, they're already making progress, but they still have a lot of work and persuasion to do, especially perhaps in Latin America, where Latin American countries have historically had a good and friendly relationship with Israel, and where there will be intense revulsion against the actions that Hamas took 10 days ago. I suspect that the Russians will also have to wait until opinion in India also develops. The Indian government historically has been very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but Prime Minister Modi and his government are extremely hostile to terrorism, very understandably. India has been the target of violence by various groups, Islamist in places like Kashmir, and of course Sikh. And the Indian government, therefore, has no tolerance of terrorists at all. And given what happened in southern Israel on the 7th of October, it is unsurprising that for the moment at least, Prime Minister Modi's sympathies seem to be more with the Israelis. But over time, as this conflict continues, as this crisis continues, that will slowly change, or at least I suspect that is what the Russians think. And as I said, by putting forward a resolution in this way, along with all the other diplomatic activity that they are now engaged in, the Russians are starting to move the dial. Well, that's the Russians. The Chinese have also been extremely busy. Wang Yi, like Putin, has now been working the phones. And I say working the phones, but he's also had in Beijing a meeting with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Lavrov went to Beijing in advance of his chief, President Putin, and that gave an opportunity for Lavrov and Wang Yi to meet. They're old friends. They get on very well together. They once said that they formed Team China-Russia together, so there we go. Anyway, they met and they talked about many things, about the relationship between China and Russia, but they also talked about the situation in the Middle East. And this is what the Chinese readout says that Wang Yi had to say about that. The two sides also had an exchange of views on the Palestine-Israel conflict. Wang Yi said that China condemns all acts that harm civilians and opposes any violation of international law. It is necessary for the UN Security Council to take action and for big countries to play an active part. The pressing task is to cease fire and end the war, bring the two sides back to negotiation, and establish corridors for emergency humanitarian assistance to prevent more serious humanitarian disasters. The fundamental resolution is to activate the two-state solution as soon as possible so as to reach broader consensus and develop the timetable and roadmap for restoring the legitimate rights of the Palestinian nation. So that exactly mirrors what Putin has been saying. But of course, Wang Yi hasn't only been talking to Lavrov. He has also been speaking to the Foreign Minister of Turkey, Hakan Fidan, and to the Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia, Foreign Minister Al Saud. The Chinese, in their readout, give his full name, Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan bin Abdullah bin Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud. So that's his full name. But anyway, Wang Yi has spoken to both of these people. Now notice that Putin is talking to the Iranians, the Egyptians, the head of the Palestinian Authority, and to the Syrians. Wang Yi has been working the phones, talking to the Saudis and to Turkey. It's clear that there's been an agreed division, and we see China, Russia, the Russia team working. So the Russians speak to the countries that they're closest to, Egypt, which relies on Russian food supplies, and where the Russians are establishing an industrial park, and where the Russians are also now starting to supply weapons. They're talking to Syria, which is of course extremely close to Russia, and where the Russians now have major bases and troops. And of course the Russians also are particularly close at the moment to Iran. Whereas the Chinese, they are the ones who are working the Saudis and the Turks. Erdogan has of course spoken to Putin, but the job of speaking to the foreign minister was left to Wang Yi, and the Chinese have a very long, very old, very friendly historic relationship with Saudi Arabia. And I've said in my previous comments, my earlier comments, that King Abdullah of Jordan and President al-Sisi made it absolutely clear that displacement of the population from Gaza is unacceptable. Egypt and Jordan will not agree to that, and it is a red line. And according to the Chinese, the Saudi foreign minister told Wang Yi the same thing. Faisal, the Americans called him al-Saud, the Chinese called him Faisal. Faisal said that Saudi Arabia is deeply concerned about the current development of the Palestine-Israeli situation, condemns all acts that attack civilians, and opposes Israel's forcible migration of people in Gaza to the outskirts of the region. It is imperative that humanitarian supplies reach the people of Gaza as soon as possible. And Faisal expressed the hope that the international community will work together to avoid the expansion of the conflict to other countries. And Saudi Arabia believes that without the implementation of the relevant resolutions of the United Nations Security Council and the foundation of an independent state of Palestine, there can be no just and permanent settlement of the Palestine question. And Wang Yi, in response, said that China opposes and condemns all acts that harm civilians because they are in violation of basic human conscience and the basic norms underpinning international law. Israel's actions go beyond the scope of self-defense, and Israel should heed the call of the international community and the Secretary General of the United Nations and stop its group punishment to the people of Gaza. And there's talk about establishing humanitarian corridors and such things. And Wang Yi's the readout of his call to of the Chinese foreign minister's call with the foreign minister of Turkey reads very similarly. And we hear that Turkey also, this is again from the same call, that Turkey believes that civilian casualties and displacement should be stopped and the warfare should be prevented from spreading the whole region or even to a wider range. A consensus is evolving, a consensus that the displacement of the population of Gaza is unacceptable, that there needs to be a ceasefire, that there need to be humanitarian relief operations provided to the people of Gaza, and that obviously there needs to be, after the ceasefire, work towards resuming the peace process in the Middle East in order to work towards a sustainable solution. In other words, a two-state solution. Palestine and Israel, both states existing peacefully alongside each other. A mighty undertaking, but it is clearly what, as I said, this international consensus is now working towards. Now, there is now a further very interesting development, because all of these people, Wang Yi, many of the Arab leaders, probably before long the president of Iran, and others, are all finding themselves in one particular place, and that is Beijing. And President Putin has just arrived in Beijing, where he was received by President Xi Jinping. There's going to be meetings, no doubt, between Putin and Xi Jinping. In fact, extensive summit meetings between these two leaders before long. But, of course, there will be other leaders there. They're all there to attend a summit meeting commemorating and also looking to plan the way forward for the China's Belt and Road Initiative. And Putin is now straightforwardly talking about the integration of Russia's Belt and Eurasian Economic Union with China's Belt and Road Initiative. The Russians and the Chinese want to link the two to create, in effect, a Eurasian economic bloc. Anyway, that's a huge subject and one that I will be no doubt returning to in future programs. And by the way, and in parenthesis, Putin, again, that notorious international pariah that nobody supposedly wants to speak to, has just had meetings in Beijing with no less a person than Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary, and perhaps even more interestingly, the President of Vietnam, who spoke very warmly of the friendly ties between his country, Vietnam, and Russia, and before that of the Soviet Union, and Vietnam's memories of the support that the Soviet Union provided to Vietnam during its many wars in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and said that improving the relationship between Vietnam and Russia was for Vietnam a priority. This shortly after President Biden's trip to Vietnam, when Vietnam, it was supposed would be realigning with the United States. The president of Vietnam is now in Beijing, where he will be meeting with the Chinese leaders, and he's now had this very friendly meeting with President Putin. But anyway, with regard to this crisis, the key thing is that all of these leaders, quite plausibly MBS of Saudi Arabia and Ebrahim Raisi and the others, they will all be there. And they are all, in effect, in agreement with each other, and they will be talking to each other. And it's, again, easy to see how out of all of these discussions, given that there is, as I said, a crystallizing consensus about what should be done, a consensus outside the West, a consensus that does not include the West, but which undoubtedly has majority support amongst the global community. The diplomatic pressure, the foreign policy pressure upon the United States, upon the Western countries, upon Israel itself to agree to a ceasefire and an opening of humanitarian relief supplies into Gaza is almost certain to increase. Given that Israel has not been able to resolve this crisis quickly. And the realities of the situation in Gaza make that impossible. It is inevitable that it would be so. Anyway, this, as I said, will eventually lead us, no doubt, to a peace plan, probably hammered out by the BRICS states, no doubt supported by the Arab League, and of course, in his meeting with Blinken, the Saudi foreign minister specifically referenced the Arab League, probably supported also by the African Union and other regional blocs. That resolution eventually is coming, even if it's probably still some weeks or months away. And that will be a much more difficult resolution for the Western powers to parry than the one that the Russians proposed yesterday. So that's where we are in this crisis. An impasse in Gaza, growing frustration, I suspect, within Israel and perhaps to some extent within Washington, with the Arabs taking the hard line that they are taking. Big diplomatic moves going on, with the focus now on Beijing, and this mystery, this intrigue about what this huge American build-up is all about, with no doubt widespread fears across the Middle East that the Americans might do something which could be dangerous and unwise. Now, as I've said many times, this crisis is not the only crisis in the world. There is still a crisis in Ukraine. And there is, in fact, a war going on in Ukraine. And this morning, there were reports of a Ukrainian missile strike on a Russian airbase in Zaporozhye region in Berdyansk. This is one of the big air bases that the Russians use to support their troops on the front lines, and also in Lugansk. Now, there is, as of the time of making this video, very little information as to exactly what took place. And Vladimir Rogov, our old friend, the Zaporozhye politician from the Russian-backed government of Zaporozhye, he said that the attack on Berdyansk failed. Others, like Rybar, say that the Ukrainians launched 6 missiles at Berdyansk. 3 were shot down, but 3 got through. One of them destroyed an ammunition dump, and another did some damage amongst some helicopters. But the extent of the damage is unclear. And apparently there was another attack, another strike on another airbase, perhaps in Lugansk region. Now, the big intrigue is to exactly which missiles were used. And there are lots of reports across the internet this morning, and especially the Russian part of the internet, that the Ukrainians used ATACMS missiles, that they have in fact now been supplied by these ATACMS missiles. The United States has never said so publicly, but that they have been used in action for the first time. And Rybar, contradicting Vladimir Rogov, he says that there were 6 missiles launched at Berdyansk. As I said, 3 were shot down, but 3 got through. So, first use of ATACMS. And there is some reason to think this might be right, because there is photographs now of cluster munitions, burnt out cluster munitions in Berdyansk, and they have been identified by those people who know about these things as the kind of American-made cluster munitions that you would expect to find in the ATACMS missiles that the United States has provided, or it looks as if it has provided, to Ukraine. Now, if this is an ATACMS missile strike, then I'm going to make two quick observations. Firstly, this has happened in an extraordinary hole-in-the-corner way. The United States has not officially said that it has supplied ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. It's done so instead by stealth. One wonders why. What is so complex or difficult about supplying ATACMS missiles that you don't announce it? Now, there have been many instances, many cases, in my opinion, when the United States has supplied all sorts of weapons to Ukraine without announcing the fact. But it has tended to confirm, well, it has in fact invariably up to this point, announced the supply of these weapons before they are first used. So they might have arrived sometime before, but the Americans have always been careful to talk about the fact that they've been delivered before they've actually been used. This time, it looks as if that's different. And I'm going to suggest that the reason for that is because the administration worries that if it had announced the supply of these ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, that would have created major opposition, that would have triggered more opposition in Congress, where House Republicans now seem to be pushing hard, increasingly, for a stopping of all further assistance to Ukraine. So that's what I guess. Now, that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second is that the ATACMS missiles on this occasion, assuming that Vladimir Rogov is wrong and that Rybar is right, do seem to have got through and do seem to have done a certain amount of damage. Though, if Rybar is also right, it seems that 3 out of 6 have been shot down. Now, this follows the pattern whenever Western weapons are introduced into this conflict. Firstly, there are a number of early successes. There's huge excitement in the West about this, and they're spoken about as being a game-changer weapon. Then, as these weapons get used, the Russians begin to work out how they work. Their air defenses start to adjust, and eventually the effectiveness of these new weapons declines. That's been the story of the HIMARS missiles. That's been the story of the Storm Shadows. And that, I predict, will be the story of the ATACMS missiles as well, which are probably present in relatively small quantities anyway. So, yes, some of these missiles will get through. They always will, even when the Russians learn all their secrets and learn all about how to counter them. But eventually, over time, their effectiveness is going to diminish, as we've seen with the Storm Shadows and with the HIMARS. And of course, as the Russians get to learn about the ATACMS and how to counter it, they will develop air defense systems which will become increasingly effective, and of course they will share all the information that they obtained in this way with their great ally and friend, the Chinese. Just saying. Now, yesterday, alongside all his other discussions about the situation in the Middle East, President Putin also held a meeting with some of his top officials, and much of the meeting was devoted to a discussion of the situation in the Middle East. But Putin also heard a short report from the defense minister, Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, about the state of the special military operation. And this is what the Kremlin website reports Shoigu as having said. Current developments of the special military operations zone are marked by various attempts by the enemy to launch offensive actions on different fronts. They have run into our defense units on almost all fronts. Notably, we have managed to improve our tactical positions in many sections of the front. In fact, the enemy has been unable to make any significant advances. The Ukrainian authorities had planned a spring offensive followed by a summer and now an autumn campaign, but they have not achieved any notable success in any of them. On the sections along the front line where we observe heightened enemy activity today, we have built deep layered defences, which we can now refer to as active defence, because since the beginning of the summer campaign on June 4th, the enemy has suffered substantial or at least major losses in terms of personnel and equipment, including hundreds of tanks, over 1,000, almost 1,500 armoured vehicles, and they continue to incur such losses. We maintain active operations on the front where we deem it necessary to improve our position. Overall, the situation appears stable and secure. The troops are acting professionally and displaying heroism on many fronts. They are confident that they will not only hold their positions, but also continue to implement the plans we have outlined. Now, the last is very tantalizing. Continue to implement the plans we have outlined. What plans? What are these plans? Clearly, Russians do have plans. They have some plan for how they're going to win this war. We're not told what those plans are. And anyway, we'll just have to wait and see. But note two important points about what Shoigu said. First, it's clear that the Russians overall still perceive themselves to be on the defense. We've seen Russian offensive operations in Kupiansk and on the Oskol River line. We've seen the Russians take further steps near Avdiivka. And by the way, we've had significant reports here. And these reports, which come from the Russians, largely, in fact, completely contradict the Ukrainian claims, which I discussed yesterday. The Russians claim that they have indeed advanced in many places. They're still saying that they have not captured Berdichi, that village, which the Guardian had the Ukrainians admit the Russians had captured. There's some mystery about this. But the Russians, anyway, have improved their overall position around Avdiivka. They've advanced in various places. They've moving steadily and incrementally. And the plan clearly is not an outright assault on Avdiivka, but a gradual tightening of the vice and ultimately an encirclement of the Ukrainian group that is there. But all Russian reports say the same thing. This is an operation that is going to take weeks, perhaps even months. There was references yesterday, not yesterday and on previous days, about the Ukrainians having stopped a Russian blitzkrieg. I remember the Daily Telegraph using precisely that word. There is no Russian blitzkrieg against fortified defences. There cannot be one, and that is not what the Russians are doing. But overall, on every part of the front line, the Russians are now attacking. They're conducting what Shoigu speaks here about as an active defence. They're doing this apparently very vigorously at the moment in the Rabotino, Verbovoye area. They've been doing it, as I've said, near Kupiansk. They're making serious advances round Avdiivka, but there is no general Russian offensive. Shoigu nowhere refers to one, and for the moment at least, that does not seem to be the Russian plan. They are incrementally and steadily improving their military positions, continuing to inflict attrition on the Ukrainians until they are ready to launch their big offensive, which, as I said again, I suspect will happen next year. And that offensive is more likely to take the form of what Scott of Calibrated and Brian Belletic discussed in that program on the new Atlas, increasing pressure on every part of the front line until eventually, somewhere, Ukrainian lines collapse. The Ukrainians are left with the difficult decision of whether to weaken their positions in other parts of the front line, to transfer troops, to plug any gaps. In fact, we're already seeing that happen, with the cascade effect then starting to appear as the Russians are able to punch through and break through elsewhere. And then it seems to me, going back to what Shoigu said about implementing the plans, that, it seems to me, is the plans. Now, that's my Ukraine update for today. Obviously, there's been a great deal more said about these things, and I will no doubt be returning to all these topics, to Ukraine in more detail before long. But that's where we are. For the moment, Ukrainian offensive appears to have tailed off. There were some attacks apparently this morning in the Zaporozhye area near Kopani, west of Rabotino. The Russian reports say that the Ukrainians made no progress there, and that is most plausibly true. A stable front line, so Shoigu says, situation appears stable and secure. The Russians, in other words, have a stable front line, and of course they continue to gather their forces behind it. On the topic of gathering their forces, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, who is with his boss in China, actually made a rather cheeky statement when asked about supplies of shells and weapons from North Korea. He said, well, you don't have any proof that that has actually happened. And of course, we don't have that proof, but it did seem to me to fall short of an outright denial. Well, there we are. A situation where Ukraine, well, it might have got its ATACMS. It's able to make its odd strikes. It's already perhaps used up 6 of the 50 which supposedly were going to be delivered, though who knows, maybe the United States will deliver more. We haven't yet had full information about the effect of this strike on Berdyansk. As I said, previous events of this kind, previous strikes of that nature, have had only a momentary effect. The Russians have repeatedly shown that they can ride with the punch and come back and sort out whatever problems these missiles cause, and I'm pretty sure that that is what will happen. Meanwhile, the focus remains on the Middle East. Even some people in the West are now grudgingly acknowledging that the Russians, that Putin, the pariah, is back in the diplomatic game. In fact, of course, he never left it. Well, this is where I finish my program today. Tomorrow, assuming there aren't any other great events, which of course there might be, I will discuss the trajectory of Chinese-Russian relations and some articles that are now appearing in the United States, which again appear to be ringing the alarm bell over this, rather late in the day, it must be said. Anyway, this is my program for today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me repeat again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, X, the former Twitter. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also please remember to check out our shop, where we have a sale ongoing at the moment with a 20% discount. And you can also, of course, if you've liked this video, tick the like button. And please remember to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.